This is a recap presentation of what I offered at the Boston Sea Rovers 2022 Ocean Expo in a presentation entitled A Diving Technology Pivot for Pandemic Response, Treating COVID-19 Respiratory Distress with Oxygen Treatment Hoods. I'll point out that this is a non-clinical presentation intended for the layperson that tracks this work as a project from the start of the pandemic in winter of 2020 through to present. I want to acknowledge up front that the work presented was the result of numerous organizations, hospitals, community groups and organizers, and technology advocates coming together for the common good in responding to this pandemic. I also want to acknowledge and recognize the patients and families who shared imagery and stories, which I'll include later in the presentation. It may be viewed as sensitive material, so please be mindful when viewing it and potentially sharing this presentation in the future. So at this point, we're all familiar with COVID-19, at least in a very simple form or fashion, but very generally and for the layperson, coronavirus 19 is a contagious disease caused by the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 or SARS-CoV-2. Its symptoms present much like the flu, and the complications of the disease are largely respiratory. So things like pneumonia, acute respiratory distress syndrome, respiratory failure, and so on. So this is a respiratory disease, and to date has resulted in almost 8 million global fatalities. So it has certainly made an incredible impact in the United States and in the world, and is still with us and not going anywhere. And if anything, and hopefully the take home through this presentation is that preparedness for these pandemics is of the utmost importance moving forward. In early 2020, so this is say late January and certainly through February, we had a very scary time, and that was largely because we learned that COVID-19 was very easily transmissible through respiratory droplets. So things like coughs, sneezes, or even just breathing in proximity to somebody was enough to spread the virus, and it did spread incredibly fast. So our early prognosis was not good. So here we are with a very easily transmissible virus that we don't know much about. It infected people very quickly. It led to very severe respiratory distress complications very quickly, and complicating the entire situation was that our hospital system became overwhelmed. We simply did not have the capacity to deal with the numbers of patients all presenting with the same or similar respiratory complications. When we go to the hospital or another medical center to treat respiratory distress, the first thing that's done is the patient's put on oxygen. That's typically our go-to for all kinds of first aid and triage for any type of disease or medical complication. So oxygen is a very therapeutic gas. We've known that for well over 100 years. So oxygen is our friend and our go-to. When breathing is compromised, we also use positive pressure. So if we look at this very rudimentary graph on the right, it shows that a normal breathing pattern is a series of inhalations and exhalations. And while we're exchanging volumes of breathing air, what we're really doing is changing the pressure in our lungs. So our diaphragm is working to push and pull that volume of gas into our lung space. So at the end of the breathing cycle, our lungs return to more or less atmospheric pressure, so where we are sitting in the room today. When it's difficult for the patient to make that exchange on their own, the introduction of positive pressure, very, very slight positive pressure, can be done with a family of treatments called CPAP, or using continuous positive airway pressure. It's basically a source of flow that leaves some slight pressure at the end of the expiratory cycle. So there's a positive end expiratory pressure, or PEEP, that's used to ease the burden of breathing. When that becomes insufficient and the patient needs additional pressure support, there is another family of treatments called bilevel positive airway pressure. So this is essentially being intubated and on mechanical ventilation, where the well-trained respiratory therapist is in full control of the patient's breathing, and the system, which is a closed loop, can be dialed in to match pressures and certain volumes and the cycle of each breath. So this became the go-to to address COVID-related respiratory distress, largely because when you're on a mechanical ventilator and you have an endotracheal tube placed in the throat, and there are filters in line with the ventilator, it's a closed system where the virus is not easily aerosolized. By contrast, the CPAP type therapies, which are driven by a fan, it's basically just a flow source, have a tendency to aerosolize particles, and in this case virus. So there was consideration given to using CPAP type therapies early in the pandemic. However, the risk of exposing the healthcare worker was too great. So the result of that was that there were not enough ventilators to go around. These are expensive pieces of machinery. Hospitals do not have hundreds of these. They're lucky to have tens of these. They require specialized staff training. They require administration in an intensive care type ward. And there were people, in fact, put on ventilators that probably didn't need to be. And unfortunately, the early statistics coming out of New York City were that 80% of those intubated and on mechanical ventilation would end up not coming off the ventilator alive. So this was where we had this doomsday scenario in our news cycle where everyone felt like they were going to die. It was, you're going to get the coronavirus, you can't breathe, hospital doesn't know what to do with you, and you're not going to make it. So this is what we were faced with in February and March of 2020. In my line of work as a diving contractor, my normal routine is that I can be hired to solve any number of underwater problems. And in most cases, it's fairly routine and mundane. However, I've been very fortunate to have a bit of a storied career in underwater science and exploration, which in some cases made me more acutely aware of respiratory-related challenges and opportunities. So the few things pictured here that lend themselves well to our response are these portable inflatable habitats, the top two images. So these are basically confined spaces where the atmosphere has to be managed, carbon dioxide has to be removed, oxygen has to be introduced, and how that interplays with human physiology following deep dives requires some interesting science. On the bottom left is a picture of a closed circuit rebreather. So we've developed several proprietary systems for our own work and for others. So that has given me some familiarity with closed loop breathing circuits and understanding respiratory pressures and gas blending, gas mixing. In the bottom, we've been involved with some more sophisticated systems integration work and deep mix gas diving. So again, familiar with gas blending and things like oxygen toxicity and other elements that interplay well with medicine. And then on the right was a unique project in the adaptive diving community where we worked with a gentleman named Matthew Johnston, who's ventilator dependent full time via tracheotomy, and we worked with him to get him underwater and diving. So that gave me a very, very little bit of exposure to medical ventilators and some of their limitations. So as I was seeing the horror unfold on television like everybody else, I asked myself, what can a diver possibly do? And I just reflected on all this experience and said there has to be something in here with all of the overlap between diving and dive medicine and diving technology with respiratory care. There's got to be something we can do to respond to make an impact. Sometime in early March of 2022, I had a completely chance spotting on television. This is an image that came out of a critical care unit in Italy, in the Lombardy region of all things. So I took that as a little bit of a sign. But this is completely chance spotting, and all the patients were wearing this bubble over their head. And I just sat back and said, I don't know what that is, but it's quite compelling, and there's something here that we're not doing in the United States that we need to be. So I took that chance spotting and then decided to do some initial investigation. So through my initial homework, I came to discover that there's a technique at play called helmet-based ventilation. Now, at the time, this was hardly used in the United States. It's still rarely used in the United States. But the helmet itself is just a patient interface. So in that top left image, you can see a nasal cannula, which is the most common way to administer oxygen. Then there are masks used for oxygen, and then also to add a little bit of pressure, and then helmet. So these are just patient interfaces to administer oxygen and or oxygen with some pressure. The technique used is within a family called non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, or helmet non-invasive ventilation. The technique is largely tied in with this CPAP family of therapies. So it's a very benign technique, or at least it can be a benign technique, that allows PEEP, or pressure delivery, of up to 40 centimeters of water. Now, the common treatments are in the 8 to 12 centimeter of water range. But the fact that it can deliver higher pressures comfortably is the key here. So when doing pressure type support with a mask, one complication is ulceration around the face, because you have to wrench down the straps on the mask so tight to get a good fit. So with the helmet, it seals comfortably at the neck and allows pressure delivery quite comfortably. Because it creates this space or chamber, we're able to titrate in supplemental oxygen and control the fraction of oxygen delivered between 21 and 100%. And then possibly most importantly, for sake of COVID, is that you can contain this aerosolization risk. So in that bottom right image, this was from a study on a competitive device but when a filter was placed on the expiratory side of the helmet and dyed particles were introduced with high flow, you can see that everything's contained in the helmet itself. So that's a big deal versus using a standard mask with high flow. You can see that the particles are dispersed into the environment. The disadvantage to the helmets, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a few slides, but the significant disadvantage is that they require a high flow of gases to keep carbon dioxide levels down. So we need to continually flush out the space with fresh gas such that the patient's exhalations are not reintroduced as inhalations, and we have a buildup of carbon dioxide. But all in all, this was fascinating to learn about helmet-based ventilation. It certainly showed some promise and seemed like an incredibly viable path to reconsider these CPAP non-invasive respiratory therapies instead of just rushing to intubate the patient. Interestingly, both the Italians and the Chinese are light years ahead of the US with this and related technologies. The Italians have been using helmet ventilation since at least the 1980s. The Chinese probably around the similar time, certainly into the 90s. But they're light years ahead, and part of that reason is that they recognize that stress on critical care units needs to be mitigated, and you can do that with this technique. And part of it, at least from the Chinese standpoint, is that there are alternate techniques that play well into more holistic and Eastern type medicine. So both challenges and opportunities were exposed with this homework, and then we carried on. As I continued my homework into the helmet ventilation technique, I learned that only a very few U.S. physicians had implemented this for respiratory distress previously. All of them did advocate helmet use for COVID-related respiratory distress, but it was still very new, and we're talking just a few voices out of thousands or tens of thousands of professionals in the respiratory community within the United States. So clearly there was some opportunity there, but obviously an uphill battle to get the technique adopted. One physician who used and advocated the technique was Dr. Bhakti Patel at the University of Chicago Medical Center, who published a paper in 2016 which showed helmet ventilation efficacy in respiratory distress. And its results were that somewhere in the 20 to 30% of patients who were treated by helmet techniques were kept off of ventilators, mechanical ventilators, which ultimately increased survival for the disease state. So those numbers were pretty remarkable in that in this case there would be the potential to impact millions of people in the United States and the world with this alternate treatment modality in place. So in learning about Dr. Patel's study and others' usage of helmets in the United States, the term off-label came up frequently. So in the U.S., the Food and Drug Administration authorizes medical devices for specific indications. In the U.S., these hoods or helmets have been used, but they're only indicated for hyperbaric use. So in the top image, in this scenario, a hyperbaric chamber would be flooded with or pressurized with air rather than the whole room with pure oxygen, and then oxygen could be delivered locally at the patient. That's one approved indication for these hoods. And they're also indicated as infant oxygen tents. So that cute image at the bottom right is one scenario. So these hoods could be sealed at the neck, or you can actually place the infant's arms inside the hood, and this would seal at the belly or at the waist, and you created this enclosed environment to administer oxygen to an infant. So the US FDA had authorized these similar devices, but only for those use cases, which meant any adoption of hoods or helmets for respiratory distress would essentially be done at the physician's discretion and with their assuming risk. That created a number of challenges because most hospitals are risk adverse and have standardized protocols, and deviating from those protocols while incurring a level of risk is something done only under extreme and extenuating circumstances. So while that was done early in the pandemic, it was not the desired approach, and certainly not going to work for more widespread adoption. So when looking at the current market opportunity of the time, again, March of 2020 or so, there are a couple of US manufacturers and suppliers of these hoods for hyperbaric or infant use, but they were under strain, so their manufacturing and distribution capacity was maxed out. Pre-pandemic, the market for these things was somewhere around a couple thousand units per year, which is very, very small in the grand scheme of medical supplies. And of course, there'd be an unknown demand post-pandemic. And then we evaluated some of the financial and other risks in getting involved in making these things available. And by this point, being several weeks into our due diligence process, really felt a sense of moral and ethical obligation to carry forward. I felt like I was in a position to move the project forward, had the contacts and resources to step on the gas, so to speak, and had seemingly motivated some demand from the medical community. So at this point, I was contacted by lots of people in the respiratory field saying, "Oh, I understand you can supply these helmets." And it was not quite the case at that point in the project, but there was obviously this mounting demand for helmets. So what do we do? I had amassed literally a mountain of physician support, and we had a stack of letters of support and requests for product from more than 30, possibly like more than 40 very well recognized respiratory clinicians and pulmonologists. So I approached Subsalve USA. Those of you in the dive community know that Subsalve is the leading manufacturer of lift bags. So these inflatable devices that help us with salvage and moving heavy objects underwater. They're also involved in a number of engineered inflatable products that are not underwater related, but they're best known for their lift bags historically. Subsalve was local to me in Rhode Island, so I approached Rick Freiberg and Richard Heath, both in the picture with me, and said, "Hey, I think we have an opportunity to do something for the pandemic. I have all this support and demand from the physicians. What do you think?" And it didn't take too much convincing. I think we were on the same page that we felt an obligation to do something if we had the means to do it. Around the same time, I was positioned with an organization called Commerce Rhode Island and seeking a funding injection through their innovation voucher program, which is basically some small seed funds to catalyze a research project through to completion and help it commercialize. So we were discussing the technology related to underwater habitats and rebreathers, I reapproached them when the pandemic got pretty scary and said, these are the same principles, very similar technologies, very similar manufacturing requirements. Forget about the dive stuff. We're going to pursue these oxygen hoods. And that was our big pivot away from diving technology in the heat of the moment, and to refocus on medical devices as part of a pandemic response. So again, not as a business venture per se, but more in meeting our ethical and moral responsibilities to respond and do what we could. So Commerce Rhode Island did support us with this innovation voucher program, which gave us some seed funding to get through the early stages of the project, and then we were very much on our way. Subsalve, as the manufacturing partner of the project, stepped up in a big way. Rick Freiberg, who started the company in the late 70s, is a true master of the craft. There's a degree of art that goes into all of his products, and the initiative here was just incredible to see. So we went from a blank slate to having functional prototypes in the hands of doctors in Rhode Island and New York City within just 2 weeks. We secured an order through the Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency to help get production ramped up, and through all of this excitement, managed to have over 1,000 units committed before even having a finished product. Now, of course, that's exciting from a business standpoint, but made for a fairly scary time because we were dealing with everything that the rest of the world was dealing with. So there are supply chain issues, materials availability concerns. We still had regulatory hurdles to overcome, and then the stress of the imminent demand and, in all honesty, dire calls for help from the medical community in the U.S. and internationally. It was quite an overwhelming time from a number of perspectives, but within a couple weeks we had what we called our product, and we were thrilled to introduce it.
As part of the COVID-19 crisis, we've been asked to use our expertise as well as our technology to assist in the treatment process. We've developed a completely flexible one-piece treatment hood. This hood is worn by the patient, one piece for one-time use. There are no changeable parts necessary.
A patient could spend significant amounts of time in this device, so it's very important that they're comfortable and relaxed. It's an optically clear vinyl that surrounds the entire patient's head. So this creates a very comfortable environment. One of the most critical features are the connection ports. These are standard 22 millimeter fittings that are available in hospitals and other medical facilities worldwide. This makes it very easy to attach hoses, filter assemblies, oxygen flow devices, oxygen sensors, PEEP valves. The setup will vary somewhat based on the respiratory care team's input and what's available on site. That's very important because this is just as applicable in a hospital setting as it is in a field setting. This product becomes a very important proactive step in eliminating the need or significantly reducing the need for a patient to be intubated and on mechanical ventilation. This is a filter that is either N95 or equivalent, which means as the air supply passes through the helmet, the patient's exhalations are vented through a filter. So in addition to being therapeutically beneficial for the patient, we're also protecting the healthcare workers by limiting the amount of virus that escapes into the work environment. This gas supply could come from any number of sources. It could be a CPAP machine, a BiPAP machine, a single limb ventilator, or combinations of all those gas supplies.
We believe that this hood will take away some of the demand for ventilators. We're hoping that we will contribute to the cause and save lives ultimately.
Production ramped up very quickly to satisfy the initial demand, and also to anticipate staying ahead of projected demand. So you can see on the left the base portion of our hood, which includes a dry suit neck seal. At least the early versions were dry suit neck seals. So for the divers tuning into the presentation, if you had trouble procuring a dry suit or getting a dry suit serviced in 2020 or 21, it was quite likely our fault. So we had acquired in excess of 30,000 neck seals, which wiped out global inventory for diver neck seals at the time, and we were putting them to use here. So production moved very, very fast, and we took the perspective that we were going to deliver these regardless of where we were in the regulatory process, because there was sufficient demand. We were getting good feedback from physicians that did know how to use the device, and to be effective, we needed to get them out there now. Previously, I had mentioned that similar devices were only indicated and authorized for hyperbarics and for as infant oxygen tents. So there was no hood or helmet device indicated to treat respiratory distress in the United States. We needed to figure out how to get there very, very quickly. The US FDA had put out a declaration for an emergency use authorization, or EUA, which was a call to businesses and those involved in medical device supply chains to respond, and if they had the ability to help fill supply chain shortfalls of standard medical devices or had new medical devices that could assist with the pandemic response, the FDA wanted to know about it, and this was, in theory, a means to fast track approvals so that we could get them in the hands of physicians very quickly. So that process required several items. There were testing requirements, so I had applied our funding from the Innovation Voucher Program in the state to build up a testing array, which is pictured. So as a means to evaluate things like flow restrictions, carbon dioxide buildup, and the ability to flush it out. Was there pressure loss anywhere? Were there leaks in the system, leaks in the hood itself? How do we titrate oxygen in? Just basically understand all of the mechanical and potential physiological effects of this device that may be seen in a hospital setting. We need to map all of that out for the FDA and show that it would be effective and reasonably safe for use. There was also a quality assurance and quality control requirement in the medical community that's called ISO 13485. We were able to demonstrate that our production quality control was equivalent to that, and that became acceptable to the FDA. We needed physician endorsement, which we had, and then also develop and present an instructions for use document. Being a diver, I'm big into checklists. So we use checklists all the time, particularly when using sophisticated life support and closed circuit rebreathers, namely. So similarly, we devised a checklist to use these hoods and attempted to make this as simple as possible. Complicating that effort is that I am not a medical professional, nor have any respiratory therapy background. So it was a challenge to get through the instruction for use document. Fortunately, our reviewer at the FDA was a true collaborator through the effort, and we were able to cooperatively get through this in a reasonable fashion. Step one was just to connect this thing to limb circuits. Now, there's a simple configuration pictured at the right, but we learned very quickly that different configurations were required depending on what the flow source was. That didn't completely flush itself out during the instruction for use preparation period, so we were careful to note that the clinician must determine which hospital infrastructure they have in place and ensure all components are in supply. So we wanted to make it clear that we were providing the helmet interface, but we were not providing instructions in how to use it to administer effective treatment. So we were expecting that the medical community, having experts in respiratory therapy and whatnot, would be able to easily adopt this and work it into their existing protocols and systems. That did not work out as we anticipated, but we will discuss that in a few slides. Step 2 in our checklist was to do an inflation check. So once the helmet was connected to whatever its flow source was, we would establish a minimum flow rate of 60 liters per minute. Now, that number came from some literature in the early 2000s. We now know that that's on the high side of what's needed to effectively flush out the space of carbon dioxide. Nevertheless, we stuck with that guideline. You would hold the neck seal closed, and then observe the hood inflate and hold positive pressure. So this is essentially a pre-dive check for a rebreather, right? It's a hydrophobic, or in this case, leak-proof pressure check of the loop of the system. Step 3 was to place the hood on the patient. It's best done with 2 people, where you just outstretch the neck seal, place it over the head, and release it gently on the neck. Straighten out the neck seal to make sure it's comfortable. Divers are well familiar with how dry suit neck seals can take some adjustment to get just right, and we were mindful of the fact that patient in respiratory distress would not want to feel like they were choked. So we ended up offering the device in several different sizes, and as time went on, introduced a custom silicone, very thin, comfortable silicone neck seal that's extremely comfortable. So it wouldn't be appropriate for diving, but it was specifically designed for this medical application. It makes the entire thing very, very comfortable. The next step would be to secure these underarm straps. So when this hood inflates, it would have a tendency to lift up on the head, so the straps go under the arms, help cinch the whole thing down. And then we advise that a rolled towel or pillow can be used in the armpits to reduce any chafing. But all in all, the steps to set up and then put the hood on a patient were very, very simple. So the last step in our 5-step plan was to treat the patient. And our recommendation was to simply treat the patient according to guidelines within the medical community literature. Of course, there wasn't much of that in United States-based literature. There's a significant body of it in Europe and elsewhere. But again, we emphasize that the guidelines may vary slightly based on the gas supply configuration. This ended up being a significant cause for confusion. So I spent lots of time doing in-service visits and training sessions in the Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut area, as well as doing in-service presentations via Zoom internationally. Lots and lots of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. calls with all parts of the world to make the information available. But what became apparent to me was that flow sources were wide and varied between hospitals, even within hospitals, in different sections of the hospital, and it became a challenge. So we weren't at it from a business standpoint. We were not in a position where we wanted to educate clinicians on how to administer a treatment. For liability reasons, obviously. So we still wanted to maintain the position that we were providing the interface, and that it was up to the community to determine how to use it according to existing best practices. So as of August 2020, we finally heard from the FDA that we were granted our emergency use authorization for the Subsalve oxygen treatment hood. It was very exciting, sigh of relief, because we did take that leap of faith in delivering devices for the previous 5 or 6 months. But I wanted to point out that through this time, it was a heck of a race in the community. So we weren't the only group pursuing this initiative and doing our best to respond to the pandemic. The first picture is Long Systems, so they're a company who had been making the hyperbaric hoods previously and have an FDA authorization for hyperbaric use. The second image is Amron International, also US-based, who has FDA approvals for hyperbarics and as an infant tent. The third image was a company that came up in New York called Viatil. They did not make it through the EUA process, but registered their device as an oxygen tent. The fourth image is a competitive company, StarMed. So the device is very popular in Europe. They were cleared through the EUA process after 3 or 4 months after us. And the last image was from a team at NASA who endeavored to produce a hood. They did not make it through the EUA process. And from a competitive standpoint, one of my prouder accomplishments that we beat NASA to productization. So it was really an incredible race. Several of these folks are still involved in the marketplace with others as well, all for the greater good of responding to the pandemic, and everyone did some fantastic work through the process. So soon after getting through the EUA process, which is obviously a high point and celebratory moment for everyone involved, we were then struck with a bit of an uh-oh moment. And I started receiving inquiries from the medical community about how to connect our hood to XYZ device. And not being expert in the respiratory care or critical care community, honestly, I at that point didn't know what many of these devices were. Of course, I studied up on it and learned the best I could, but it turned out that there were a variety of different flow sources at varying levels of care within hospitals. There were different makes and models between hospitals and different approaches to what types of machines were used from region to region and country to country even. And machine access within each area also varied. So there was no universal flow source that would satisfy the 60 liter per minute requirement that was widely available. It was all, the questions were constantly, how do I hook up the hood to this? How do I hook up the hood to that? Complicating that were that there are existing hospital protocols and standards of care in place everywhere in the world. And in the US, because there was still a new treatment modality, there were not, and still are not in many cases, treatment algorithms in place. The hoods just simply aren't part of the playbook. Complicating that again was some confusion about where the hoods are best applied along the progression of the disease state. So the ideal fit is use with CPAP type therapies early on, with early onset of respiratory distress, so as a mitigating treatment. However, we had physicians that wanted to use the hoods in a bi-level capacity because the patient may have been obese and the mask didn't fit their face correctly or was too uncomfortable, and they needed a means to deliver pressure and oxygen with a different type of interface. So we didn't have answers for how to operate in all these various configurations. So we had to take some time to study up and make this as simple as possible. So I found myself at a place that I was hoping we wouldn't be at, being that we needed to provide a more acute level of instruction to use the hoods. And it was obviously getting very complicated given the variety of devices and just types of devices available to clinicians. So I went back to our test bench and did a little breathing circuit 101 testing. So I acquired a number of different flow supply devices and started running tests. And as it turned out, the breathing circuit itself varies quite significantly depending on what the flow source is, and that's a function of how pressure is controlled. Is it controlled at the machine versus at the hood with a PEEP valve or other restrictive orifices? It's a function of where supplemental oxygen is introduced. It's a function of where filters are in the system. So the breathing circuits, the limb circuits, require an entire another body of work and science to be able to match these well with this new patient interface, this large volume interface, and the given flow source. So pictured here on the left is a wall gas titration technique. So this was what was used in the Patel study. In the middle is a setup for a BiPAP V60, and on the right with a dual limb, one option for a dual limb ventilator. So I laid out circuits for probably close to a dozen different flow sources, and at the end realized, while all this is possible and it's great, this is an entire body of work that needs to be put through its paces, and it would take decades for the science to be run through and for the medical community to adopt this and then be worked into the standard treatment regimens. Far too complex. So we're in pandemic mode. Our business here is about pandemic response and not reinventing the respiratory healthcare system. That is a project for somebody else in another lifetime. So we figured that we needed to consider some other directions. In addition to breathing circuit 101, we had to define some gas blending 101. So again, as a diver, we blend gases all the time. We do it on our backs in rebreather systems. We do it during the process of partial pressure blending and making nitrox and other mixed gases. There's all kinds of techniques for mixing gases. So we had to line this out for a variety of configurations depending on what that primary flow source was, and then spell out how long a typical medical cylinder would last for the given fraction of oxygen delivered. So this gas blending is not as obvious in the medical community as one might expect. So in in the dive world, our objective is to end up with the desired partial pressure underwater, which means we need to know precise fractions of oxygen as we're blending topside. In the medical community, the literature is more spelt out in terms of flow. So the patient, a statement might be the patient was administered oxygen at 5 liters per minute, without a defining conclusion of that sentence that says that resulted in administering, say, a fraction of oxygen of 30%. So there's the hoods introduced this interesting paradigm where we now have control over the fraction of oxygen very acutely, and because the flow rate, the cumulative flow rate through the hood can be very high, it's possible to over dilute the oxygen and have it not be effective. So there's this balance of in oxygen blending that I think the dive community can contribute significantly to in medicine by presenting at some point in a future publication how to do this continuous blending essentially on a patient's head. So we spell this out the best we could to get through the crisis at hand and then continued on our way. So as it became obvious that there were a number of barriers to entry in the US marketplace, despite our best efforts, I decided to shift some attention effort to low and middle income communities. So through this whole process, I was receiving phone calls and emails from all over the place, throughout the US and the world, really. But was really impassioned by the calls for help from some of these places. There were a number of initiatives that sprouted up to bring helmet ventilation to these resource-limited settings because it was recognized that CPAP-type therapies would be an advantage. They didn't have any mechanical ventilators, so it was this concept of something being better than nothing, and the mindset in a lot of these poorer countries is that they're thrifty, use what's available. We see this in diving all the time, where you're working in a remote area, and we joke about everything can be fixed with duct tape. Well, that type of mindset is present in the medical circles in these poorer countries. So that was very exciting. So we had groups of people that were needed help, they were hungry for help, and they were willing to be thrifty and creative to get these concerns with flow under control and be able to administer a treatment that they previously didn't have access to. So I ran out one demonstration at the Subsalve factory. That's the image on the bottom right. Just as a demonstration of reassurance to the community that this is a simple, it can be a very simple technique. It doesn't have to be overly complex like it has been made out to be in the United States. So here I set up 10 individuals by myself with a flow source and supplemental oxygen, showing that in a mass triage scenario, helmet ventilation could be a very powerful tool. So the question was, how do we continue to address this flow source issue and what is available in these low and middle income communities? So much like diving, simple is good. And we arrived at an understanding that CPAP devices are basically sleep apnea devices. It's just a blower with a pressure control. While a medical device is very simple, they're widely available, both unused in people's homes and available off the shelf. So on the left is actually pictured a device manufactured in Brooklyn, New York by Nanotronics Health called the Inhale. We adopted it as our primary CPAP device because interfaced exceptionally well with the hoods, and its range of control worked exceptionally well with the hoods. So that was one flow source that we were able to advocate. And then on the right is a Venturi valve. The Italians, a couple of the Italian companies, offered medical Venturi valves with their hoods, but those valves were not available in the United States. So I went ahead and engineered our own valve. It's a pretty nifty contraption. So it uses the Bernoulli principle. Basically, you connect oxygen up as the drive gas and at low flow, and then based on the shape of the valve on the interior, it would work to entrain room air and create a high flow. So we'd input about 8 liters per minute of oxygen and cumulatively get out to the hood around 50 liters per minute. So it's a pneumatic solution to driving the hoods with a sufficient flow source. So I was very excited about that development. And these two combined gave us two very simple but good options to run the hoods in areas where they didn't have ventilators and they didn't have access to other sophisticated critical care resources. And the instructions could be made simple enough that the layperson could really implement them. And that was important to us moving forward. So just to touch on a handful of the really impactful and touching success stories along the way. The first international interaction I had was with Bolivia, and I had received a call that, in one weekend there were some 400 plus people that had died in the streets for not having access to care. So obviously we wanted to do whatever we could. I ended up donating significant number of hoods and CPAP machines and other consumables, and we're able to get them delivered via a cooperative effort with the local Rotary chapter and the Anglican Church in Bolivia, and made quite an impact. So this individual, he was treated in a critical care setting, but we had others treated in more field type settings. They were treated successfully and able to walk home. Similar circumstances in Nicaragua, where we were able to get devices into field hospitals in more rural areas, and patients were successfully treated. In Nigeria and other parts of Africa, we had supported a program called the Circumvent Project, which was a cooperative effort of a number of volunteers, as well as researchers from the University of Rhode Island, New York University, Emory University, and others, who ended up funded by the CDC Africa office to conduct a fairly large-scale clinical trial using helmet ventilation with CPAP devices. So we were happy to support that as a sponsor and provide equipment. And results of that program are still going through review and publication. We were able to distribute hoods to Bangladesh, both through commercial channels as well as in support of research at the Bangladesh University for Engineering and Technology, where researchers actually designed their own Venturi device and used it to successfully drive the hoods, and a number of patients were successfully treated. We got devices into Iraq, of all places. This was, from a story perspective, this was among my favorites. So we were contacted by an organization called the Free Burma Rangers, which are basically all former special ops guys in the United States that get together and run these medical missions in some war-torn parts of the world. So they were very excited to, very, very excited to fly medical supplies into Iraq and go through various checkpoints and acquire weapons along the way and do whatever special ops guys do. But in the end, they were able to get equipment to hospitals in need. Patients were treated successfully, and we were more than happy to make a very small but positive impact in some of these parts of the world that we don't usually connect with. We were also able to get equipment into Ukraine, both commercially early in the pandemic, and then more recently donated a significant volume of supplies in support of their wartime needs. And again, patients treated successfully in critical care settings and outside of critical care settings, and were able to go home. So while we did see a fair bit of success in these lower resource settings, we were hit with another uh-oh scenario. And this is not just us, but everyone involved in respiratory care and pandemic response, being that there are oxygen shortages, very real oxygen shortages. With the hoods requiring a high flow, granted it's often air from a CPAP type device or similar, as I mentioned, that high flow dilutes any oxygen introduced into the system as a supplement. So it requires a lot of oxygen to boost the fraction delivered to the patient to a therapeutic level. When oxygen is in short supply, that's of course a huge problem. So a potential solution to that is coming back to diving yet again and incorporating rebreather technology into these breathing circuits. Now, this is unlikely a short-term solution in resource-limited areas because of the added expense of hardware. There are a number of circumstances where oxygen consumption reduction is still hugely valuable. For instance, working in remote areas or having to do very long duration evacuation or response. So what we were able to set up was taking the scrubber from our commercially available rebreather and doing some creative plumbing with off-the-shelf respiratory components, and ended up with a closed breathing loop that we're able to deliver and adjust that peak pressure from 4 or 5 centimeters of water up to 10 or 12 centimeters of water, and then adjust the fraction of oxygen delivered from low 21 to as high as 90+%, but while only consuming 1 to 2 liters per minute of oxygen, basically just over the metabolic consumption of the patient. So we've advanced this concept with researchers and anesthesiologists at the University of Colorado and University of Washington, and have a pending patent related to positive pressure-based systems and methods having decreased fresh gas flow requirements. So like any technology development, it's obviously a long path with a lot of steps, but I think in this unique situation where the burden of oxygen shortages is so massive in the world, the ability to recycle it via rebreathers could be a big deal. And we've gone through some bench testing as well as some practical testing, and are looking forward to continuing to advance that concept with a number of partners in the near future. So where that leaves us today, and possibly in the future, is that we distributed somewhere over 30,000 devices, which wasn't bad, but I think our collective hope was that it was in the millions, not just for sake of the business end of it, but that we really could have helped millions of people, and that 8 million number fatality could have been much lower if the helmet ventilation techniques were adopted earlier in the pandemic and there were more know-how in the community associated with it. There still remains quite considerable regulatory confusion in the United States that's unlikely to resolve quickly. So we still have hoods and helmets being used off-label in the United States, and we also have several hoods and helmets that are cleared through the EUA specifically for respiratory distress. So the community really needs to find clarity in what the difference is between these devices, if any, and there may not be, that's fine, and what is the appropriate regulatory pathway for their future approval. So should this be a first aid measure or early first response, early intervention measure, or should it be restricted to critical care? And that's a matter of, is this a class 1 device or a class 2 device, and everything that comes with that by way of testing, additional scrutiny, and of course expense to maintain those registrations. This is a similar thing we're seeing in hyperbarics right now, with controversy over mild hyperbaric therapies, where are low pressure chambers to deliver oxygen just above atmospheric pressure. So these things take decades to resolve, one way or another. Third, I think the community would significantly benefit from standardized training within the respiratory care training regimen, as well as conducting large-scale clinical trials in the United States using approved devices. Thanks to the efforts of many, the World Health Organization has now recognized helmet ventilation among useful patient interfaces for delivering respiratory therapy. So I think that's a tremendous success from everybody, from all the companies that were involved. On the point of oxygen, again, oxygen access limits the utility of these high flow devices in the poorer countries, despite the ease of use. And as a recent, very sad example, there's a project in Uganda currently underway, and I just learned that their oxygen supply had run out, and within an hour there were 16 fatalities. So access to oxygen is incredibly important, as well as exploring new technologies that help us repurpose or recycle oxygen, lower the oxygen requirement burden. That could come from diving rebreather technology, which we're quite familiar with, as are others. And I think there's tremendous utility there in the areas of field medicine, anesthesia, long-distance medical transport, and possibly for other use indications. And then in the picture, not to make light of the entire topic, but we did explore with oxygen hood usage in the veterinary world. So in the veterinary world, of course, a nasal cannula doesn't fit dogs and cats very well. So the hoods were experimented with as an interface that made a better fit and helped post-operatively. So they would oxygenate these spaces and help wean them off of anesthesia post-op. So it was a pretty exciting trial, and we expect to see some progress there as well.
All right, test drive of the presenter's helmet. So far, so good. It interfaces very well with our rebreather. The PO2 is very stable.
Being a diver myself, of course, I wanted to bring this full circle in some respects. There are several lessons we learned about ventilating these smaller spaces as opposed to larger spaces like our habitats that were interesting, and we applied that to the development of a new type of diving helmet, which is intended for underwater presentations. So in this case, it's a device that provides an unobstructed view of the face, allows the audience to interact well with the underwater presenter, and in this case, the helmet mates with our rebreather technology to create basically a bubble-free underwater astronaut or aquanaut effect. So that was an exciting success that we brought back to diving. In close, I want to share with you a quote that I just found recently from Dr. Christian Lambertson. Now, Lambertson is probably considered the father of the modern frogman, possibly even the father of diving. His work predated scuba with open circuit techniques. So he gave us the Lambertson Amphibious Respiratory Unit, or LAR, which is the precursor to the LAR series of rebreathers used by special ops communities around the world. He had an incredible career in both Army and Navy medical units. But in any case, in 1944, in the medical journal JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, coincidentally, or perhaps not, the same journal that Dr. Patel's study was published in 2016, Dr. Lambertson wrote a paper called "A Small Efficient Hood for Oxygen Therapy," and provided a quote which reads, "Much remains to be done before the physiologic aspects of oxygen therapy are completely established. Meanwhile, progress in therapy with oxygen is hindered." And that's quite a impactful statement, considering that it was 75 years between Dr. Lambertson referencing these oxygen hoods, and in the United States anyway, Dr. Patel realizing their efficacy. There's just so much work to do in medicine, diving medicine, and oxygen is a fundamentally important part of that. I'm a true believer that if diving were important, and not just to us as divers, but important to the world as a discipline, we would be in much better places to respond to things like respiratory pandemics. And this journey is a perfect example of that. So it should not have taken 75 years to advance Lambertson's concept to the point where it would be an effective everyday tool. Diving can be important again. I hope it will be, and there are elements of that benefit everybody. We learn so much about ourselves through concepts in diving physics and physiology, and just how we interact with the world around us, and how our bodies respond to entering these alien environments on the planet. There's so much there that if we're a part of our standard education very early, in junior high school or high school, these very basic concepts and the benefits of oxygen, and what we can do with a little bit of pressure would be well understood, and we would be so much further along in medicine and in the health of the planet, and have possibly a much different direction for the future. So with that, thank you.